I was like, it must be feeding season. They're all having their babies.
All right, now let's get started. We are on the live stream, I believe. So, welcome. Again, today we are doing an open forum, so you brought your question. So, we're going to do just a little review of last week with, is this too loud? A little loud? It is? A little loud. It's kind of going boom, boom. I have two ways I think I can square that. Check one. One, two. How about that? A little better. A little better. There we go. So we'll review a little bit from last week's Romans. Before I get started, though, we made this wonderful introduction in the early service, but I know some of you were not in the early service. So there's a couple announcements. The first one is Justin did come down with COVID after the trip. Probably got it somewhere in New York. But I don't think many of the other choir folks, I think one person did go positive with COVID. So we're, Joe and the Quigleys and I are leading worship this morning. And so anyway, keep Justin in your prayers, but he's doing fine. I think Gabriel may have, got it as well now. But anyway, so that's the first announcement. And then we have a great guest today. I mentioned the early service, so do this real quickly. Knee replacement coming up on the 18th of April. And so I'll be out for a month to 2, maybe 6 weeks or so. Don't say more. Pastor Mike Greenwald is a retired ELCA clergy person in our synod and in Port Orchard. And I am so thankful that we have such a gifted pastor to help out during this time and work with PJ. And Pastor Mike is a retired Navy chaplain, so got lots of great Navy connections with this congregation. So,
did you warn him what he might have got into?
I didn't warn him at all. No, I'm going to let him just, enjoy that. Yes, exactly. So, okay. So where we were last week. So I'm just going to do a few things. We can spend the whole time on this subject if you want, but just to prime the pump, so to speak, because I know you've got questions out there. I know a lot of you love the open forum times that we do. So get those ready. It can be about what color the carpet is to, predestination. I don't care. Whatever it is, we get to talk about. But let's kind of just remind you where we were before the break last week, because I was in New York, and then we'll do what we want to do. So where we were is we were looking at this whole issue of being subject to the governing authorities. We are at chapter 13. Can you believe we've gotten through 13 chapters of Romans and this year? And then the whole debate about church and state comes up around this text. We went on in chapter 13, but just to go back to that, there's a couple things that happened in the news that I wanted to highlight that are maybe examples of this. So I want to reiterate, Paul was not putting out a big doctrine of how the church and state go together. He was concerned that Christians be seen as good citizens. That they're not revolutionaries. And remember that you've got the Jewish revolt, the first revolt starting to really gear up. Jerusalem's destroyed in 70 AD. The Romans start coming in and conquering cities in the late 60s. And Paul is writing in the 50s. So just know that that's gearing up. And so these new Christians, are they going to try and overthrow the state? Are they revolutionaries too? And I think that's a part of what Paul's saying, is that he wants Christians to be good citizens. There obviously is limits to our subjection to the state, and we talked about that last week. But, Luther and the Reformers looked at this text as really important to this understanding of what we've called two kingdoms. So actually, I want to just exit out of this so I don't have to go walk through the whole thing. We looked at 2 weeks ago some of the Lutheran Confessions, and this is a kind of, well, let's do this one here just as a reminder. So we put up this this kind of oh, there it is. Okay, I don't know why it disappeared. So let's get all this up here. One back. There we go. So Luther liked to say that as he read Scripture, there were two kingdoms, or two ways, two words, two means that God works in the world. And in the civil world, God works through creation and temporal laws and civil government. And it is kind of compelled action. And reason and law, and there's lots of, so the civil world, we want order, we don't want chaos. So the church and the gospel, the right-hand kingdom can thrive. So God works and is involved in the civil world. Like, I think when Jesus came, he wanted, to affect how the world operates. But God does that in a little bit different way than he does in the right-hand kingdom with the gospel. And so anytime I start talking about these, I start going, but I don't want you to think that they don't overlap, because they do, but we want to separate them but not pull them apart too far. We want this to infect that, but at the same time, our goal is not to make the government Christian. I have no desire to make the government Christian. I want to see the government be just and truthful. And, that is, for me, is motivated by my Christian faith. But I'm not interested in making the government Christian as such. I'd love to have all kinds of people who are moral involved in government and working. So how you make a difference is different in the right-hand kingdom and the left-hand kingdom, Luther would say. And so, when you think of the right-hand kingdom, you think of faith active in love. You think of willing action, not compelled action. The left-hand kingdom, I drive down the freeway and then, it says 60 and I go 70 on 3 and you're going to get a ticket. That's the way it works. In the church, I'm forgiven. It's okay. No, left-hand kingdom, I have to pay the fine, okay? So there's absolution over here. It's different over here. You have to pay. So anyway, I love, and really the way God works is through a preacher, through the church, through the word preached. That is the way a difference is made versus law. And so Luther really felt like it was important not to pull these two, or have them influence, but just make them distinct. Let's see, William Lazarus, let me throw up one quote from him. I don't think we got to this quote last time. So I think this is Lazarus. Important Lutheran theologian and teacher. I think he's passed away now. Instead, Luther spoke of two ways in which God rules everyone. One form of ruling is by means of the promise that makes faith and whose kingdom is new and eternal. The second is the way God uses the law to establish external peace by means of the sword in the temporal old kingdom. Or, when you hear sword, consequences, Neither of these ways of ruling was sufficient without the other. You needed both of them. Because some people have heard Luther and the Reformers talk about the two kingdoms, and they have said, well, Lutherans are pacifists, they don't care what the government does, and that's not true. But we just want to keep them separate. So here's a couple of examples that I thought of this week. Both, in my view, are semi-tragic, confusions of the two kingdoms. So I don't know if you know this, but just a little church history. You're aware of the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. The split happened in 1000 AD. You have the Orthodox Communion, which is a little different. They don't have a pope as such, but they have different leaders, I guess you could say, of each area. And so the Orthodox Church is under one umbrella, but there's the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox. They're not all the same. Well, did you hear that the main patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church endorsed Putin's war? Now, that person hopefully did that with not having the information that we have. But that's a tragic confusion of the two kingdoms. One, it's a wrong advocacy. So we could say, come on, how can a Christian leader support what Putin is doing in the Ukraine right now? So it's you would like him to say that person to stand up against the state and not get pulled into the state. But regardless, this is where you're going to be a little bit, this is where it's going to get, you might support soldiers who go to war to fight in a just war, but I just don't, remember what Luther said. I brought Luther's quote in, I don't know if I put it up there, but when Luther was talking about the Crusades, and, he said exactly this. I wish I'd have remembered to pull it up for you. If a bishop took the cross before me into battle, I would run the other way. You don't fight a war where you're killing people with the cross like it's a Christian thing. No, you might do it to save your country from an invading force. As a good citizen, yes, you would go to war, and yes, you would fight. But you don't take Christ out there where you're going to be slashing and killing people. See, that's a confusion of the two kingdoms. That's the left-hand kingdom. That's God working through governments for justice, peace, rightness. And so, yes, as a Christian, I might go to war. But I don't go to war and kill people in the name of Jesus with the cross in front. Whether it's a just war or not, you don't do that. So here, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very connected to Putin and the Russian government, Protestants are not well thought of, that it's been a struggle there, but they're there. You don't do that. Even if it's a conflict that you support, like let's go to World War II. My generation, I've not had to go to war. I've had, people that I knew as I grew up who went to war and Desert Storm and all of that and all of the other conflicts after that in Afghanistan. But I have never lived through a world war like some of you have, or even lived through the Vietnam War. Whether or not a war is just or not, that's a left-hand kingdom thing. The right-hand kingdom doesn't say, yes, let's go. Like, for instance, Islam thinks, the radicalism, let me be very careful here. The radical fringe of Islam looks at the United States being in Saudi Arabia and whatnot as a religious conflict against the Christians. Not all of Islam sees it that way by any means, but that radical fringe, look at it that way. Well, we don't want to be pulled into that. This is not a fight against Christianity and Islam in some of these places. This is against what's just, what's right, what's about freedom, etc. Now, are there Christians and Muslims on both sides of that? Of course. The number one thing is that I've heard where I think this is championed or we get confused about is, so how does the church affect the government? In my opinion, this is just Bill Crabtree, take it for what it's worth, is that the church shapes individuals who are involved in the government. And that is how the church affects. Now, a lot of times we want the church to take a stand, and maybe there's a time when the church does do that. But I get nervous about that. Because as I've been a pastor for over 30 years now, and I've seen the issues come up, and I've seen how I've had people come from the Roman Catholic Church and say, see what our church has? And it was a voter guide. This is the way you should vote. These are who you should vote for. To me, that's a confusion of the two kingdoms. My job is to say, are you just? Here's the biblical story. You go into that voting booth and you vote the way you're going to vote. So there's lines that can get crossed. Well, in our current denomination, it's very committed to being politically involved, for better or for worse. And sometimes I worry about that. But I'll just put that out there and let you mull that over. So you go back to World War II or go back to pre-Nazi Germany, and the Lutheran Church gets a big black eye, as it probably should, about that it kind of got sucked into Hitler's. Now the criticism on that is we don't want that to happen again, so we're going to be more involved. This is the trick. You just hope the church is involved in the right way. Maybe the real problem is that the church did get sucked into that the two kingdoms did get blurred in Nazi Germany. The church should have just kept confessing, whether it made a stand against Hitler, that would have been good, but it certainly shouldn't have got sucked into his world, right? So you can see, if it would have stayed separate, of course they would have never allowed that, and there would have been persecution and suffering, and lots of Lutheran pastors that we don't even know about. We know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We don't know a lot that were shipped off to the Eastern Front, and we never heard anything about. So there was more resistance than I think what we know. But it was sad. But the church got one way of looking back at that is not that the church should be more involved, but the church should keep that distinction. But again, you decide on that. So there you go. This two kingdoms thing is really fascinating. I think it's really important and helpful. And again, I'll finish this way, and then we can say, okay, you got it, Pastor Bill, let's move on, and we'll talk about what color the carpet is or something. The soldiers and the police officers I've found to be the most helped by this distinction. When I've talked to an officer who's had to take someone's life and feels so horrible about it, say, look, one, you have God's forgiveness, but you were doing your duty in the left-hand kingdom as a police officer and protecting, the peace. A soldier who's had to take people's lives in battle, you were doing that. In the right-hand kingdom, guess what? You are forgiven, and God loves you, and so this distinction has really helped the consciences of people who have had to do some really tough things in the left-hand kingdom. Does that make sense? Yep. And again, we talked about the Hacksaw Ridge movie with the Anabaptists, and they don't separate the two kingdoms. And so he went into battle, which was amazing, and he wouldn't fight. He wouldn't take up arms, but he rescued countless soldiers, which is amazing. I mean, it's one of the most great Christian stories I can think about, really. Can't even imagine it. But again, that tradition doesn't distinguish the two. So as a Christian, I cannot participate in the left-hand kingdom that way, whereas we would see a distinction. Okay, you want to.
What was your second story? You had two, you said?
I forget. Okay, so good. Greg in the back, and then we can keep mulling this or clarify, or we can take a different turn.
I just want to go back to one a couple weeks ago. Traditionally, Peter is seen as the law person, and Paul is seen as the gospel. But you go to Peter's speech in Acts 5:29, he's talking about the gospel.
Absolutely.
And this thing with Paul that we've been doing, he's talking about the law. So I just...
Yeah, absolutely. I think if indeed there's been some of that, it's a misnomer, for sure. Perhaps where that comes from, Greg, a little bit, is that Paul in Galatians talks about Peter as the apostle to the Jews. And he saw himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, that's Paul's stuff, because if you read Acts, think about the centurion. and Peter's vision that all things are clean. And so he's preaching, but yeah, probably, as Acts transitions from Peter to Paul, Peter might be understood more on the law side of things because he's in particular preaching to the Jewish people. But of course, he's preaching the law and the gospel. Think about his first sermon in Acts too. I mean, this is for you, the forgiveness of sins. So absolutely, Peter preaches the gospel beautifully. And I think, so it's good that you bring that up so we can clarify. They both preach the gospel. They both preach the law and the gospel. But Paul understood his mission to be more of a Gentile focus, and he saw Peter more to the Jewish side. I don't know if Peter would agree with him, though. So, no, great question. Excellent. Did that help? Is that good? Yeah. All right. What else? The awkward silence moment. Kevin.
Aren't Peter's keys a sign of law?
Aren't Peter's keys a sign of law? Okay, next question. No. No, that's a great question, Kevin. So Kevin is referring to the office of the keys, which, remember, Jesus, and of course Kevin's got some wonderful Roman Catholic Boston background. Peter is, Jesus says, on you, Peter says, you are the Christ, and Peter says, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but God has revealed this to you, and upon you I will build my church. And he talks about giving the keys to the kingdom and the forgiveness of sins. And so when you start thinking about bishops and then there being a pope of different church centers in ancient Christianity, you had Rome and Alexandria and Constantinople as you get into the 300s, 400s. The church began to see that it was the successors of Peter and Paul, perhaps, or whatever, that it's that order that is, they have authority to govern the church. And so Kevin's question, I think, isn't the keys given to Peter about law, like order and authority and whatnot? And that's a great question.
Good answer. That's a great answer.
I really do. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say this way. I think that's a real difference between the Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Protestant view of authority. That Peter's keys that he was given was about the absolution, binding and forgiving. And all the apostles got that. And I think Jesus breathes his Spirit out on all of them and says, you're to forgive the sins. So we all have that authority. And it is the particular gift of the church to loose sins. And I start thinking about Luther's, the altarpiece in the church in Wittenberg, Germany, the town church where Luther preached that's still there, and Lucas Chronic painted this beautiful altarpiece, and it has like 3 segments, but one of the segments is Luther's kind of pastor, his name is Bugenhagen, with keys. And there's 2 figures there, and one of the figures is a noble, and he's still chained up because he's proud and he's not confessing his sins. But then there's this peasant who's being set free. And so Luther really believed that the office of pastor and the office of the church is to give the forgiveness of sins. So now, going back to Kevin's question, is the office of the keys about law? I would say no, it's about gospel. But the church has looked at it as you're the one in charge, and your successors then are the ones in charge. And Protestants would say, no, that's the body of Christ. And so we're free to have a more democratic order, which is, of course, very cumbersome and not nearly as smooth. But again, you put all that power in one human being, and what do you get? Corruption sometimes. I think historically, I'm not saying anything about this particular pope or any particular pope, but, you know, so I would say it was probably understood as law, but I think misunderstood, what I would say. Does that help? Yeah, behind you, Greg, is Joseph.
Maybe you can jump to the source material. When Jesus said, whatever you bind in earth is bound in heaven, was that you singular to Peter or you plural?
Good question. Okay, so what's that going to be? That's going to be Matthew. What is it? I don't think it's that. Where is his last confession in Matthew? All right, so we'll search for it. Let's just try bind. Keys of the King, whatever you bind, Matthew 16. Well, I was within a few chapters. Anyway. Here we go. So, some say, John the Baptist, who do you say that I am? And Jesus answered, blessed are you, son of Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but to my Father in heaven. So you're asking, is this singular or is this second person, personal pronoun? Let's see. I usually have a filter on here, but maybe it's in the new. Let me just see if I can turn my second person plural filter on. It's down here. I pass it. I'll find it. Don't worry. It's all right. Safety. Okay, morphology. Imperative mood. Here we go, morphology, second person plural. There we go. Aha! Oh, Greg, you have saved the day. You have answered the question. So this little big U here, can you see that? So it's just a filter that my little fancy program can do. And so when I turn that on, anytime it's a plural U versus a singular U, it makes it big. So I don't have to go to the Greek and see. It's plural. But to you, who I say, who to you? So he's talking to the whole group. But maybe not. So flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. That is talking to Peter. So he's not talking to the disciples at that point. But so he is asking the group, who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks for them. So maybe the Catholics win that argument. No, I'm just kidding. No, but that is a classic. That's a classic. Our brothers and sisters in the Roman Catholic Church see that's why we have a pope and we have cardinals and bishops and priests, that whole thing. And Protestants view that it isn't Peter himself, it's his confession that is the foundation of the church. And so that's just a difference in the way we see authority. So it gets right to your question, Kevin. Is the keys about law or gospel? I think it's about gospel. Yeah, good. Okay, good. Now that was a deep one. All right, can we make it a little easier this next time? All right. Anything else? Go a different way.
What color is the carpet?
Well, we have the people who built who created and designed this church. Why is the carpet the color it is? Because it doesn't show dirt. No. Didn't most carpets used to be red in churches? That color? No. I have no idea. So, good.
Pastor, we have a Sunday school.
Pastor Mike is we're working that out. The question was, are we gonna have Sunday school like this while I'm out? And I believe we are. So Pastor Mike is gonna lead that. I don't know, we're gonna keep talking about whether we continue the Romans thing or he does something different that you'd like to do. So, but there will be. So, yeah, absolutely. All right, come on, let's see. I know you guys have got something. Okay, good.
A number of years ago, when we were in Dresden with Dieter's cousin, I asked her, because the churches are beautiful over there, they're very large and not well attended, and I said, how do these churches keep up? And she said that the government taxes them. Now, is that just the tax for the maintenance of the church, I would assume, and not for the running of the church, and how does that separate?
Yeah,
Yeah.
does separate church and state.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. There's probably some people out here in the class that could answer the way it is in Germany a little better than me, because it's complex. When I was in Wittenberg for my sabbatical, I just went there with the assumption, yeah, the state funds the church. But I got pushback on that a bit, that from some of the church folks that are actually still participating in the church, that no, the church it actually owns so much property that they've given the government, that this, the government support is actually not, it's not necessarily a tax. They look at it that way. But it's a little bit complex. But maybe to simplify it, yes, in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, in Germany and other places, there has been a state church. This is a Norwegian heritage congregation, and in Norway, his friend's family could have his service here, and he was more from he was Danish, really Danish in his background, and there was it Finnish? I don't remember, but anyway, they wanted some of the service to be in the home language, and they found a chaplain who was, over in Seattle who could speak the language and do some of the service. So she came over, and I met her before, and she walked into this church. I'll never forget this. And she looked around. Wow. Who pays for this? And when I told her the members of this church do, jaw dropped. Jaw dropped. You mean people come here on Sunday? That's exactly what she said. So, yes, in Europe, kind of the way, again, this goes beyond my expertise by far, but, and again, there might be some folks, Mike or whoever, that can answer this way better than me. But after the Reformation, and this is a real condensing of a long history, but different parts of Germany, different parts of Europe went Reformed or Lutheran or stayed Catholic, and the way they resolved it is whatever the leader chose is what you were. So if in Saxony, it's Lutheran, the elector, and of course they were for the most part, although that bounced around. If the elector went Catholic, then the whole group, that whole area was Catholic. So what you start getting happening is because Luther and the Reformers said, hey, this whole thing with the Pope and the cardinals, there's problems with that. So then how are you going to govern? Well, the stopgap measure was to put people in civil world in charge of overseeing the church. Huge mistake. I think we can look back. My mom always said, Billy, hindsight's 20/20, and you can do that for everything. Well, yeah, so that merging of church and state was a huge mistake, so that you can have big cathedrals, like Audrey, you're saying, and no one goes there because it's supported and taken care of in some fashion by the government. And so the people come and they get baptized and they get married and they get buried, and that's now, so I don't think we can totally say that all of the secularization of Europe, a lot of European countries, is because of that, but it's probably a factor. I know there are big churches in San Francisco, because I'll just say this, I don't know about Seattle because I came from California many years ago, that had 10 people a Sunday. But they paid 2 full-time pastors, and they paid all of the upkeep on these big, beautiful buildings. Why? Because they had an endowment that was $5 million, $10 million, or even more. And so they used the endowment to cover the church's costs. Is that a good thing for a church? No! Because we are sinners. And we need to have our feet to the fire sometimes. So, like when we have big estate gifts here, we don't use that to pay salaries, and we'll do that, use it for special things and stuff like that. So I don't know if I went afield to your question, but I think that is, so yes, I think it is a confusion of church and state. We need to keep those separate. And that's, or the confusion of the kingdoms to some degree. So no, that's a great question. And I think in Germany, I think I've mentioned this many times, the estimates are like in Wittenberg, around 8 to 9% of the people would say they're Christian. And in Germany in general, it's like 4%. In this country, we're still over 50. We're at about 60, although that's dropped, I think, 15 percentage points in the last 15, 20 years. So if I remember my surveys right. I don't know what it is in Norway. Now, I've had people talk about Norway differently. They've said, well, we don't go to church all the time, but we have a vital faith life in our home, and that very well may be. So I don't want to be cast aspersions too much here. Yeah.
Yeah, it might be a good time to bring up what you often tell us, what is the church?
What is the church? Yeah.
Is it the building?
Yes.
Or is it the people, the congregation?
Right, absolutely. And again, which is interesting that we've gotten merged into state because sometimes in the Lutheran tradition, because the Lutheran Confessions say that the church is the word and sacraments preached according to the gospel and scriptures, and that's what makes the church the church. So now, you'll note that Lutherans can do government however we want to do it. And you look out the Lutheran movement throughout the world, some have bishops, some have presidents, some have, are more top down, some are more congregational up. Like this congregation was ALC, which, was I left Missouri and found a perfect home in ALC. And ALC was more affiliation of congregations. And the LCA was a little bit more almost like in my view, like the Episcopal Church, where the synod and then the congregations. And the way you saw that come about, if you don't know, and this is still true today in the ELCA's constitution, if you were an LCA church and you wanted to leave the ELCA after the ELCA is formed, you would have to get permission to keep your property from the synod. ALC, as long as you affiliate with some other Lutheran group, the congregation keeps their property. And that was the only way you brought those two big Lutheran churches together back, is to have that written in. So where you're from makes a big difference. So that shows the congregational versus. So Lutherans, in other words, I just say that to say that Lutherans have governed themselves in whatever way works. And there's pluses and minuses to that. So yeah, okay, Kevin.
Yeah, my friend Moises in Sevilla, Spain, I asked him why his church was always empty. And he said, I don't need to do that. It's more important to go help the priests during the week, go out and see the poor and do ministry in the streets.
Right, yeah, and so there could be lots of other ways that the reason why people aren't, in worshiping every week than just that they're not Christian anymore. We definitely want to keep that in the mix. And it depends on which country you go to too. Like Spain is still very Catholic and, it's different. Yeah, please.
I just think, what a loss. What a terrible loss. There's so much to be gained by fellowship, worshiping corporately.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how you do the Christian walk by yourself. That's what I like. The folks that either go inactive, that are members of this church, or just in general, I don't need the church to be a Christian. Well, that could very well be, but man, why would you want to? In my view, I don't know how you do it, because some Sundays I shouldn't say this because I'm leading worship. Some days I'm more all in than others. And then I see some of you being all in that Sunday, and I'm like, okay, I can keep going, So yeah, exactly, Pat. We need this, like what we're doing today. That keeps us going. Yeah, and maybe it'll turn around. But the other things, it wasn't just the fact that the church got lazy because the state was taking care of them. The secularization in Europe is partly also because of all the wars that were connected with religious fighting. And the narrative is, well, let's get rid of all this religion stuff and we won't have these wars anymore. That's very much a part of it. You look at the 30 Years' War that most people don't know about before World War I, that kind of came on the heels of the Reform, movement. Way back before World War I. But it was a fight between different sects of Christianity. At least that's the way it was understood. It was really a fight about different people in power, wanting to gain power. But that was connected to church, and so that's the way a lot of people look like, if we just get rid of all this religious stuff, we're going to be fine. Now, that obviously isn't proving to be true, because, it isn't said religious commitment, it's human sin that causes these things. So anyway, but there's a lot, and then the whole scientific, enlightenment, people viewed the church as kind of, unfortunately, some people were successful in driving a wedge between, thought and church, which we still fight in this country. I run into lots of folks all the time that are like, well, I believe in evolution, so I'm not coming to church. I go, well, evolution is a big subject, what kind of evolution do you believe in? And you can come here and believe in evolution in lots of different ways, or they think that Christians we put our brain to the side, and that's just so false and so wrong. But that, again, people have been successful in driving that wedge. So that's probably partly the European thing too. So yeah, but it's sad when you go there, isn't it? When you go and they're like museums there. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Because it's mostly tourists in there.
Tourists, yeah. But they are there. The church is still going. There's a
Centuries ago, were churches well attended?
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what broke up the habit of going to church.
Yeah. That's
Was it
great.
because of the wars?
Was it because of the wars? I don't know. And that'd be a great question for somebody who's from Europe. Can we get a mic here? Matt maybe he's going to throw in on that. I could say there's probably lots of reasons, and Audrey, I think what I'd like to say is some of them are similar to what we see happening now. I'm sure it didn't all go from 90% of the people saying they're Christian to 4% overnight.
Yeah.
Are we in that same slide? It's a question. I don't know. Matt?
I'm reading a book about the Civil War and the time afterward.
Yeah.
And we didn't, the whole society did not have the things we had to treat the people who got mental damage.
Yes.
And I think, thanks to the right hand of this country anyway, we do see that very extent. You take Europe, and just look at what's going on in Eastern Europe.
Yep.
There, this is something that's going to go for generations.
Absolutely. There's histories of power battles and human sin. Yeah. Matt was just highlighting that the Civil War, and that this country has really tried to care for the people, and also pointing to the history of all these conflicts in Europe, that it goes way back, and it's absolutely true. So yeah, I mean, I love it when people ask me, why is the church declining? Boy, sit down and give me a couple cups of coffee, and I'll give you about 4 hours on that one. And there's all kinds of reasons, and but it's a fascinating question about Europe. I don't know if people want to chime in on that, but yeah. All right, cool. Well, we've got maybe time for one.
Maybe this is oversimplifying, but there is nothing new under the sun. And if you read the Bible, you'll see that there is no society that stayed strong in their faith.
Yeah.
We all get lazy and self-motivated, and in our country seem lazy because everything is really easy for us generally.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the state of humanity.
Yeah.
So we can look at the little things that change how we do faith here, but in the big picture, it just seems like humanity has a really hard time staying faithful.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a great point, Dennis. I think that you could probably also look at when Christianity has thrived the most, and it wasn't when everything was good and wonderful.
Yes.
You know, so you think about this Africa, southern hemisphere, where Christianity is doing quite well, exploding. The people in Ethiopia that I was with, they didn't have all kinds of boats and TVs and video games and golf courses, and you know, I have to convict my own self at this too. They didn't have golf, all these other fun things to do, and they were in church, and that was their lifeblood. You know, so I think you could be onto something too. Prosperity doesn't always economic. You know, it sometimes is a detriment. Yeah, Pat.
Stores never were open on Sunday.
Oh, sure.
It's a whole different society.
Yeah. The wonderful blue laws and what would happen if we didn't do stuff on Sundays now? Well, might be a recession. But you know, and that's the question. Again, it's actually, Pat, I'm going to use that to maybe tie us back. Was there any others though before we kind of close up? Let me use that to talk about the two kingdoms. Christians, because everybody was Christian, there were laws that you couldn't be open, right? Isn't this? Yeah. Okay. Now, was that good or bad? Don't answer that yet. So, one could say that was a confusion of the two kingdoms. Whether or not it's good for society and people to have a day when no stores are open, that's left-hand kingdom. That's probably a good idea, actually, right? If we could actually have that and people could rest and turn off their TV and go sit on somebody's front porch and talk to them, like, you know, what I hear people used to do on Sunday mornings. You went to 2 or 3 places, you know, or after church. But that's a left-hand kingdom. The church really shouldn't be dictating what the civil government does, unless so many people just happen to be Christian that I don't go to store. You know, if indeed, but of course you don't. Anyway, I'm digging myself a hole here. You know, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think the fact that we no longer have the blue laws and this a Sabbath shows that we are becoming more secular. That's part of it. But it also, you know, you could also make the case that, like for Lutherans, like Luther said, the Sabbath isn't about not doing anything on Sunday. Sabbath is about hearing God's word. That's what Sabbath is. Now, do we need rest? Absolutely. So we could work rest into our society in whatever way. But I think we do have to be concerned that, you know, we're getting further apart from those this is what I worry about. Here's, I'll finish it. Oh, this way. Oh, that's fine. There are a lot of people rejoicing that the church's influence gets smaller and smaller. Oh, there was the second story. I remember what it was now. I listened because I got on the Russian Orthodox. Thank you. Thank you, God. I also watched a YouTube video of an evangelical megachurch pastor talking about how Gog and Magog in the Revelation is Russia, and that this is all biblical times, and this is God working. Again, wrong. So it comes at it both sides. That was the other story, an example of where this goes. So when it comes to our society, what I worry about, I see Christians, like I see the more real conservative evangelical folks wanting to make the government Christian. And then I see that sometimes from the Roman side of things too. And I think that scares me. I don't want those to get married. But what does also scare me is that there are people rejoicing that the church no longer has the influence it used to. I just wish it had the right influence. And what I mean by influence, that people are shaped as honest, justice-loving people who enter society and do what's right, even if they're not going to get punished or rewarded for it. do we really want to rejoice that the church is no longer educating people on the Ten Commandments? And that there's a God who cares what I do in the world? Do we really want to rejoice about that? I say no. And yes, there's always been corruption in the world. But I'd say today the crisis is that people don't have an internal compass anymore. I mean, they have less of one than they ever have. Maybe, when you get older, you look back and you say, oh, the younger generation. So now I'm old, so I get to say that. But I worry about that. As bad as the church has messed up in the past, I mean, really? You don't want people involved in a congregation that says that caring for the poor is important and is going to go down there and feed people who are hungry and hurting? Do we really want to celebrate that? Because I don't see somebody else stepping in and shaping those morals. When we want to just talk about justice without the justice maker and giver, I don't think it works, just personally. Now, I don't want to make, again, the government Christian, but I sure want religious people, whether they're Islamic or Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever, who are shaped with a sense of morality and the golden rule and the Ten Commandments. I want them out there in the world. I want that shaping to happen. And I worry today that what we are seeing is the fact that this is what happens when people are raised with nothing. Does that make sense? All right, there we go. All right, I brought it home. Anyway, thank you. We will get back to Romans. We'll be into 14. We might even finish up. We'll see before. What do we have? We have Palm Sunday. We have one Sunday before Easter, so we probably won't finish up, but it's fun. All right. God bless you. Have a great rest of your day. This was fun. Sweating.
Next week is Palm Sunday. Next week is Palm Sunday. And then it's Easter Sunday. Usually it's going to be business spring break. This is their side break. Love class. Palm Sunday. Easter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I even been farmers, Lutherans,
Jill. I can't remember this day.
even though. Yeah, because then when you lose someone, no time. So you're absolutely right. Oh, that's that.
Not everybody. A lot of people.
I feel. Don't forget your thoughts. Let me just-
Interesting, I didn't know you'd never done that, okay.
I just have to.
Way to go. Have a nice trip, I'll see you when you get back. On Sunday. Yeah, on Sunday. No, you may not have pictures at all.
Like a phone. The one I have right now is a loader. On loan. No. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll just get to that.
That's a good question, so I'm gonna have that conversation with you.
Because I get it. You look at some of these trip captures, they got I mean, it's no joke. 4 houses, many in and what's his name? The guy Joel Osteen. I mean, you look at their.
Well, my sister used to live
Yeah. Some of these churches, you don't need to even live in the societal. Oh, I know. Right, we're not, and so, but that's the thing. It's an interesting question. So it's interesting though. It's fascinating. This question just keeps coming up, and I've been formulating the question. It's like, well, in your, why would you go to Is it really great? Why would you go if you did? And most of the time, your will is going to support you to be a good person. And I don't think that's why the first reason you go to.
That's because the emperor and the czar said you gotta be there.
Well, right, that's true.
And you agree with their words,
What
because you don't want to
people
get shot.
think, they want to change. I'll go to a church when it's good enough, righteous enough, whether it's what the pastor provides or whatever. See, that's the question. I don't think that's what it goes to.
I wanna make,
Yes, exactly.
the fall of the imperial world emptied the churches.
Thank you. Blessings on your trip. Thank you.
Where are you going?
They're headed to Africa. Tanzania, right? Yes. Oh, Kevin, sorry, I didn't mean to walk away.
Oh, no, I said what I said.
Yeah.
But that the change in the imperial world really sank it.
Oh.
And by the way, Peter was never the Pope. He
No.
was the Bishop of Rome.
He was the Bishop of Rome.